Welcome back to Apollo. Today we're going to look at the popular subreddit r/ProRevenge. How I got my bully arrested for a completely different thing. My story begins 5 or 6 years ago. I was coming home from school. I was probably 14 to 15 years old. My commute included catching a bus from its last stop. The last stop of the bus was like a cul-de-sac where the bus turned around, waited for 10 to 15 minutes before it would go, while the driver had a rest and the passengers got on. I got on the bus and stood in the middle. There were a lot of people already on it and all of the seats were taken. When I looked outside, I saw 3 boys, slightly older than me, sitting on a bench looking aggressively at me and talking. One of them was looking straight into my eyes. I will call him main aggressor. I could tell they were talking about me and straight away knew they had bad intentions. This goes on for a few minutes when the bus engine started. Just before the doors closed and the bus set off, they got on. Main aggressor came right next to me and looked me right in the eyes about 2 inches away from me. I turned away and got to the front of the bus near the driver. I was so scared and I wanted to call my father to wait for me at the bus stop, but my phone bill wasn't paid and my phone was useless. Just one stop before mine, they suddenly got off the bus and ran away looking back at me. A few weeks later, while going to school, I caught a different bus, which sets off from the same place. As the bus drove off, I saw the same 3 guys outside. Main aggressor notices me right away and yells to the others, "Hey, that's that guy!" They started walking towards the bus, but it drove away. The 3rd time I saw them was the scariest. It was like a year later. I was coming home on a Saturday evening on the first bus. The bus was almost empty and I was sitting in the back. I saw the same 3 guys getting on the bus from the front door. My blood ran cold. They hadn't noticed me yet and I immediately rang my mom and told her to wait for me at the bus stop. I was looking out the window pretending not to see them. They were messing around at the front of the bus when main aggressor noticed me. He smiled to the 2 other guys and walked up to me. Standing next to my seat, he started saying things like "nowhere to run now" and "I finally got you," while pushing me. I didn't say anything and pretended he wasn't there. Luckily, my stop was coming up and as the bus stopped, I suddenly got up and ran to the door. He tried to grab me but failed. I ran out of the bus and into my mom's car, which already was at the bus stop. I looked back and saw all 3 of them getting off the bus and trying to chase the car. My district is small and I found main aggressor on social media and knew who he was. A typical aggressive teenager wannabe gangster. Heard from a few friends that he was well known as a bully in our district. I'm a very shy and timid person, so the experience stuck with me for quite a long time. For 1 or 2 years after that, I was afraid to go near that bus stop, or even walk alone in the dark. I would always look around in fear on buses or when walking on the street. The revenge part. Fast forward to about a year and a half ago. 20-year-old me started a job at a construction company. I became friends with most of the workers, including the foreman and the boss. They all liked me because I did my job well and was generally friendly. I was working hard because I needed the money, which helped me progress in the company quickly. I started as a construction worker, cleaning the construction site, carrying around materials, assisting form workers and rebar workers, etc. But about 6 months later, the foreman started giving me more difficult tasks. About 2 months ago, we were removing formwork with 2 of my colleagues when the foreman came over with another guy and said, "This is our new guy. He'll be working with you. Show him around and take care of him. It's his first job." When I looked at him, I was shocked. It was main aggressor. Surprisingly, he didn't recognize me, probably because my appearance has changed a lot in the last 5 years. But I hadn't forgotten his ugly face. Didn't give him any info about me that would make him remember. And he wasn't into talking a lot anyways. I didn't tell anybody about him because I felt that was nobody else's business. At the moment, he didn't do anything wrong, but I just couldn't stand him and I wanted to get rid of him ASAP. We have a storage at the construction site which holds expensive tools and machines, drills, angle grinders, etc. One morning, we came to find it broken into and there was missing equipment. There's one security guard, but his office is on the other side of the construction site, next to the entrance, which is about 50 meters away and his view to the storage is obstructed, so he didn't see anything. There is security camera footage, but it was low quality and the 2 guys visible were wearing dark hoodies. The police was called, but there was nothing they could do. The next day, I came home from work. One of my dad's buddies had stopped by to show him the new handheld circular saw he bought secondhand for cheap. A bell immediately rang in my head. When I saw it, I instantly recognized it. I took a picture of it, saying I was interested in buying a similar one. My dad's friend told me who he got it from, and from another check on social media, I found out it was main aggressor's father. It all started coming together. I told my boss and foreman everything I knew and showed them the pictures of the saw. My dad's friend also confirmed to my boss that main aggressor is indeed the son of the guy he'd bought the saw from. Me and my boss went to the police and told them everything. The next morning, there were 2 officers on the construction site. Where main aggressor showed up, they arrested him. The sweetest part was me telling him while he was handcuffed, "Nowhere to run now." He thought about it for a second and looked at me with wide open eyes. He suddenly remembered who I was. Anyways, under the pressure, he told the police everything. Turns out his father persuaded him and one of his friends to steal the equipment. His father would then sell it and they would split the money. I don't know much about his father, but main aggressor is held on multiple charges, including theft and trespassing. I also heard from a friend that he's been arrested before for assault, but they'd let him go. This time, he's not getting away. Sometimes I feel bad for him, but then I remember what a jerk he was, and still looks to be. The time I ruined my high school teacher's career and got her fired in the greatest way possible. This story is widely known amongst my family and is constantly brought up and joked upon in my group of friends, even years later. A buddy of mine suggested that this is the perfect place to make it public, so let's get into this kind of screwed up story. Backstory: I was a senior in high school at the time and I had never been the brightest student. I was a solid C student and I had never received a detention or had any kind of bad student record. This is important because to this day, I still have no idea why the teacher treated me this way. The teacher, who we're gonna name Mrs. Frank, had been a teacher there for more than a decade and was widely known for being a petty, heartless hag who the administrators saw as the golden child. Mrs. Frank taught algebra, which is my worst subject, so naturally I had issues understanding the lessons and would ask questions frequently. To some, those questions were easily answered, but to me, it was like dealing with rocket science. Usually when someone asks a dumb question, no one should address it. However, in Mrs. Frank's case, she would belittle me in front of everyone by saying things such as, "And here comes the slow boy again. Wow, surprise, surprise, you don't understand it again. Really? We have to go extra slow for you today, don't we?" And so on and so on. I tried going to the administration about it before, but again she was considered the golden child. They would send someone in to examine her during class, she would act respectful and normal for one day and go back to being the next. This would go on for half a year until I had enough. I went to a local Radio Shack, bought a recorder, and secretly recorded every insult she would throw at me. I would sometimes instigate just to make up for lost time. Go ahead, feed the fire. Fast forward to the end of the year and I'm sitting in Mrs. Frank's class when I ask a question. Her response, and I quote, because it's burnt into my brain, was, "I've been teaching here for 10 years and that was the single dumbest question I've ever heard come from anyone's mouth." She continued the lesson without answering. I calmly stood up, packed up my stuff, and headed to the nurse's office to dismiss myself from school. You were allowed to dismiss yourself if you were 18. I went home, compiled all of the brutal tapes into one glorious masterpiece, and headed back the next day to show the administrators. I sat down with the principal and we listened to a couple of the insults before he stopped me. He wanted more witnesses present as well as Mrs. Frank. He told me we would meet the next day where I could show him and the rest of the administrators the full tape. I walked into school the next morning being the most nervous I've ever been for anything in my life. I was called down to the office where I met with some board directors, the local school police officer, the principal, the vice principal, and Mrs. Frank. What follows were some of the greatest minutes of my life. I watched as the administrators went from fed up with being in another useless meeting to furious and speechless, with some of them keeping their mouths open for the duration of the tape. I also watched Mrs. Franks go from confident and stuck up to her realizing that she had messed up beyond repair. she was publicly roasting herself in front of the most important people from the district. The tape ended, and without hesitation, the administrators looked around in astonishment, and the principal turns to me and says, "I think we've heard everything we need to, thank you." And I was quietly dismissed from the room. The final time I saw Mrs. Frank was when I was leaving the room. I looked back and we made eye contact through her teary eyes as I gave her the biggest, most evilest smile I could. I returned to class the next week and Mrs. Frank was nowhere to be found. The story spread quickly throughout the school and I was seen as a saint. I had successfully gotten her fired and made it almost impossible for Mrs. Frank to return to her teaching career, as well as cut off most of the connections she made with other teachers in the school. I had also ruined her financially because no school district in the area would hire this walking piece of garbage. If you're reading this right now, Mrs. Frank, I'd like to take this moment to tell you to go screw yourself.